First of all, the sort of notions of how high the radiation levels are rather subjective. We don't really have objective and quantitative measures of the actual radiation. But that said, it seems that if we look at the previous levels, which were reported in radiation units, millisieverts per hour, it seems that an 18-fold increase would put these at shockingly high. So this is a situation that seems to be deteriorating. I also noticed that other tanks are believed to be leaking, and some of the interconnecting pipework is leaking. And there seems to be some foundation troubles with the tanks as well. Remember, here we have some 30-odd tanks full of high-level liquor, water, contaminated with radioactive particles that were thrown up in a hurry since the explosions and the meltdowns. And, of course, now we've seen one tank failure, and it's likely, I guess, that we're going to see more tank failures. So the situation can only go from bad to worse.
And in your view and in your experience, what would it take to bring a situation such as that under control?
Well, to clearly completely rethink and rejig the approach that TEPCO and NISA, the regulator out there, has approached this problem. Essentially what they said was that we won't try and contain the radioactivity. We'll allow the groundwater that's flowing across this site to cool the slumped reactor, the melted down and slumped reactor cores in a very uncontrolled fashion, and then we'll suck up the water and treat it and put it in tanks, let it settle and then discharge it to the marine environment. That's clearly not working. That concept of dilute and contain has now become dilute and disperse, and the radioactivity, and a significant quantity of it, seems to be leaking out to the marine environment. And also, because the radioactivity in the water is leaking from the tanks into the groundwater, forming puddles, we have a reading from some of the puddles on the site, it means that the site becomes progressively more inaccessible to workmen. So the workforce is held back, and that's another problem that you can't get in to attend to the problem. So it's a pretty serious situation.
And just how serious is this? How dangerous is this for the surrounding areas and obviously for wildlife, marine life, as you mentioned there?
Okay, let's just make some very rough comparisons. If you look at Chernobyl, for example, we know the majority of the fallout was within the so-called 30-kilometer evacuation zone, sanitary zone, a little bit further in some areas out to 150 kilometers, etc. But at least the radioactivity was controlled and held within a land mass, and there were very few opportunities for that radioactivity to seep along or out beyond the 30-kilometer zone. What we have in Fukushima is an accident was about one-third in terms of the radioactivity the size of Chernobyl. But it hasn't finished yet, so this accident is ongoing, and there's opportunity for the radioactivity on the site, which incidentally involved 3 reactors and not one as at Chernobyl. So very roughly, 3 to 4 times the amount of radioactivity is available for release. We can see that accident is still going on 2 years after the event. So it's not as though, like Chernobyl, the system was controlled and contained by a sarcophagus built round the damaged reactor. Here we have a situation where the reactor fuel, the intensely radioactive fuel, is being carried away into the marine environment and beyond man's control as to how further it disperses away from the site. So, very briefly, if the control zone that the Japanese put in place was 20 kilometers and 80 kilometers on the land, the problem with it going into the marine environment, not only does it spread much further, but it also gets ingested and reconcentrated by fish, and particularly filter feeders like oysters, who can reconcentrate the amount of radioactivity in, say, a cubic meter of water from a few hundred becquerels, counts on a Geiger counter, to several 100,000 becquerels, because they reconcentrate it in their flesh. Then that's another chain, another uptake route to members of the public. The other uptake route is as it swept along the eastern seaboard coastline of Japan, the tides will take it into the beach line. You get the intertidal strip. We've all walked down a beach and seen the flotsam and jetsam of plastic cups, etc., washed up on the beach line. Well, here we're talking about tiny particles of metal fuel being washed up on the beach line. They dry out between the tides, resuspend, and blow over the local communities. So you have a very efficient and effective way of dispersing the radioactivity to human beings a long way away from the plant. That's the concern here.